Living in a Frank Lloyd Wright house for 50 years cannot have helped but change us for the better, broadening our interests and enlivening our lives.
I think I was always aware, I mean, not always, but from a young age, perhaps maybe 6, 7, 8 years old, that this house was different than other people's houses, including the house where I grew up. I think, you know, as much as anything, I remember the angles just seeming very different than normal houses, although I'm not sure at what point I actually intellectualized that and realized, you know, or could express that, but I'm sure I was aware of it.
The history of Parkland Village, which comprises 40 lots and 57 acres with some playground space in the middle and some common owned areas around, was talked about originally in about 1945 by Bob Levin and his wife Ray, Dave Weisblad and Chris, and Ann and me, as desiring some kind of a housing area where we would have more space for our lots, more playground area, and something other than the conventional rectangular lot square road arrangement. We talked about several possibilities. There was an architect in California, Richard Neutra, N-E-U-T-R-A, who was certainly very interested. Alden Dow up in Midland, who was a Wright disciple, was interested, and several other architects whom we talked to. And somehow or another we had a little apprehension that Mr. Wright would not be interested, but we always were cognizant of the possibility. So one day it seemed wise to just call him. So I called him on the telephone. He was very gracious and asked us to come up. This was about 1947, I think. My recollection is that Ann and I, Kurt and Lil Meyer, and I think Mary Greiner and Ann's sister, who was living with us, all drove to Spring Green on a lovely fall October day. Beautiful weather. We were concerned because when we got there, Mr. Wright's secretary told us that there was a tragedy the night before. His daughter-in-law had been killed along with his grandchild. And so we said, well, we better turn around and come back home and come back another day. And the secretary said, no, he wants to see you. Work has to go on. And he did. He was amazingly composed. He was very interested. We told him we had some land. He came down, approved it for the plat, and we retained him to lay out the 40 lots in the area where it is. He loved the idea of circular lots with the interstitial areas planted to native plants like sumac, honeysuckle, red briar berries, and other plantings like that to define the circles.
Frank Lloyd Wright had the idea that it would be maybe an experiment or a nice idea to have round lots. And the association, which consists of the owners of all the lots, would own the pieces in between. And it's probably fine. I'm certain at that time it was a ways out as far as an idea. And my memory is I think they even started building with those round lots. So that's the way he designed it. And it would have all worked, but for one thing. And that is, in those days, financing came primarily through government programs. And like it or not, some bureaucrat decided, if you have round lots, we won't finance, we will not give you a mortgage. So they had to then go and get an engineer or something and square off all these lots.
After we got the lot plan, we started to build our houses. I should say that we cooperated in getting Mr. Wright, buying the land, putting in the roads, putting in underground utilities. As I recall, we paid about $5,000 to the electric company and something to the telephone company to have underground wires so that we wouldn't have telephone poles and overhead lines. So I think Bob Levin started a couple months before Ann and I started to build our respective houses. Mr. Wright talked to each of us, of course, the four of us that were interested in a house designed by him. And we told him, of course, about our three children, about our interest in music and having groups. And so he designed the house with a lot of thought of us, as well as of the fitting the house into the landscape that looks down over the brow of the hill. I might mention here the word Taliesin, which is the name of our street where we have our house, is his name for his premises, his housing in Spring Green, Wisconsin, which called Taliesin East, and Scottsdale, Arizona, called Taliesin West. Taliesin is a Welsh word. Mr. Wright is Welsh by his background, as is Anne half Welsh. Taliesin means shining brow because his house in Spring Green looked down over the Wisconsin River, the brow of the hill.
The first time I really knew much about it, as far as the design of the house, was when we went to Arizona, which would have been Taliesin West, to talk with Mr. Wright about the design. As I recall, Taliesin West is a quite large area with buildings, some of which are campus, where Mr. Wright had really an entire complex with what he called apprentices, where most of the designing went on.
Ann's mother died about that same time, so when we went down to Spring Green, we explained that we needed a room for her father, who was a retired congregational minister, and so he added to the original plan, which had 3 bedrooms. He added a bedroom and an extra spare room, which we called the maid's room, but actually was for college girls who lived and helped us take care of the children and get the food and that kind of thing.
My father insisted on having a bathtub, which he thought was extremely important. He never would take a shower. So that room has a tub.
Mr. Wright helped us. These are the original blueprints, which of course he prepared. And the basic decisions that had to be made initially were exactly what was going to be the level of the house and precisely where would it be situated, where would it be sited on the plat, because there were the problems of the sunshine coming in, the view of the lake, and all of those decisions. So he helped us with those, and we got, once located, we put in the stakes, dug the foundations, then poured the foundation concrete for the walls that went up around the exterior, and the house got started and was built in 1949. We had a lot of helps when we were building the house. Perhaps the most important one was the blocks. The blocks are 12 inches high, 16 inches wide, beveled, and they're 3¼ inches thick. The exterior walls then have 2 blocks with an airspace between. So I think the airspace is 1.5 inches. So the 3¼ plus 1.5 inches all adds up to 8 inches. That's half of the 16-inch horizontal module. So that works out for the blocks. The second thing about the blocks, thing is that they're contiguous. They do not have a mortar space in between. If Ann hadn't been here, and she was really a large part of building this house, she had to make sure, after the grout kind of set a little bit, that the surface of the block was washed free of the grout. Otherwise, it would have been a terrible mess with the grout running all over the place. So she was responsible for that and did that.
I did a lot of the electrical wiring. That was quite easy to do once I learned how. Everything has worked except the 3-way switches. They never did. Fortunately, my husband had a law partner named Bob Coleman who had learned how to do electric wiring in order to go to law school. So he came each night and checked what I'd done so that I wouldn't burn the house down.
I think I first felt that the home was unique when I was young and I was a child, and I would go to friends' homes all over Kalamazoo, and then when I would come over here to see my grandparents and just realize that the way this home was put together was most unusual. And I remember talking with my grandfather some about why they chose to live in this kind of home and why they decided to take the risk of partnering with an architect like Frank Lloyd Wright way back in the days when it was most unusual in this part of the country.
When I first came to Kalamazoo and first saw this house, I think it was about 1963. Rick was in law school, and it was in the summertime, and I was taking a class, several classes, but one at the University of Michigan, a history of architecture. And of course, we were studying Frank Lloyd Wright. And I had to write several papers. And so Rick said to me, well, you've got to come to Kalamazoo, because he said, I can get you all the information you need for your paper. Pictures, magazine articles, newspapers, whatever you need. I said, well, that'd be great. So I knew that they had a Frank Lloyd Wright house, but it didn't mean a lot to me because I didn't really know anything about Frank Lloyd Wright except the little bit I had gotten in this course. So we came and he dug out the old magazine articles and things and gave them to me, and I hope I gave them back, but I really don't have much recollection.
This is the front, we call it the front of the house. It looks down to the lake. We were very fortunate in the lottery at the beginning to get this lot that does look at the lake. And Mr. Wright, of course, laid out the design of the landscape here, including, and I planted this pin oak on the right, and this sycamore on my left, and all of the pine trees that are down in the meadow, because I love to look at water through pine trees. The roof line of the house, being low and long and nestled into the ground, illustrates Mr. Wright's integration of the house design into the landscape, because this is the uphill side of the house and it's very low, and the roof line both as we're looking toward the south, where the chimney mast for the southern part of the house is, and behind us is the chimney mast for the kitchen and the fireplace in the master bedroom. These elements were all specifically designed to fit low and into the landscape. That's part of his concept of molding, melding, what have you, the house into the landscape.
I remember my dad's describing how the roof is now stones. But what he didn't mention was that originally it was cedar shakes. And frankly, there's not enough pitch on this roof in Michigan to have cedar shakes. And the reason they don't dry out and they rot. So that was an idea of Frank Lloyd Wright that just plain didn't work for this house. So the whole roof had to be redone.
Well, it was December, and I was worried about getting it closed up. So I climbed up, and as long as I worked, the other roofers stayed up with me. But it was cold. But we had a big barrel that we built a fire in, and we could come down and warm our hands for every little while. So I learned how to snap the chalk line, and it was fun.
I remember actually walking around on the roof. It's very easy to get on the roof because it's low to the ground. And I remember walking all over the roof, and I think I still remember the contours of it fairly well.
One of the hallmarks of Mr. Wright's designs in his houses was to bevel the edges of the corner windows, and so that even though the window comes up at right angles, the bevel and the glue in between keeps it wind-tight, watertight, but the view is not impeded by any part of a structural design up and down the bevel window. Instead, you can see out both sides of the right angle window that's there.
As you can see, the windows in the back here with the background and the Frank Lloyd Wright sort of signature window, corner window, where they come together as a seamless looking window. It's kind of like you're sort of outside and inside as one, without the wood being in there in the corner. It's a nice feeling to connect the inside and the outside nature together.
The sculpture was designed by Ruth Ann Fraser, a Chicago and Lake Michigan-based sculptor who works with welded steel. And she designed this for this house because it reminds her of the Frank Lloyd Wright and the Jungian influences that are present in both the house and, of course, in the sculpture. It fits into our Japanese garden. There's a stone here, three stones, as is typical of Japanese gardens, and of course the Japanese maple here. And we're very privileged to have this sculpture designed by Ruth Ann. Another thing that was very important was this wood. As I said, it's all been milled, and it was extremely important to have it done by somebody who was a good woodworker rather than just a casual carpenter. And Dave Corning came along at just the right time and did this ceiling with the bevels and the corner and the various angles. And that has always been a showpiece of the house.
Obviously, this house has furniture that was designed at the same time as the house and part of the house. And it then is different from other houses, as it's not really designed to move around from house to house. It's designed to fit in the house. Mr. Wright has his own ideas about furniture. It's quite simple and basic, and really designed to fit right in a Usonian house, which is what this is.
Mr. Wright thought we should have a room, separate room for each of the three boys, but we decided it was more important to have one big room where they could play, shoot marbles and so on. But it was sometimes a disaster because one of the boys fell out of the top bunk and broke off his front teeth, and there were occasional fights back here too.
This room worked very well for them with its separate 3 desks, drawers for their individual things. The 3 closets which they had. We had 2 double-decker bunks which they shared. And this was a really fine room for them living in at that time. After they grew up and moved out, Ann and I used it for a work room, painting room, her paintings, like the ones here on my left. And then I had a computer in here. So we used it for various projects and and painting of that sort. Behind me and along the line, not only let in great light for the boys and for us when we were working here, because they're a very wide band right across the face, the whole face of the exposure. But then also looking out, we have this marvelous view of first the yard, the trees, the meadow, and then the lake. And on the lake this morning, as in most all mornings, a pair of swans who are resident and have lived there for more than 25 years, swim and eat, and it's just a wonderful thing to be able to look out and see the lake, see the view, and see the swans. The heating is radiant heating, copper tubes under the surface of the concrete floors with a hot water boiler and some pumps that push the hot water through the floor. This provides a warm floor. There's some lag between the cold weather outside and the floor being warm, but the advantage is that if your feet are warm, you can have 65-degree temperature up in the air, but if your feet are warm, you're warm. So that really helped a lot.
Definitely one of my strongest memories of the house would be my grandfather stoking the fire. He would sit somewhere around the room and he always seemed to know right when it needed to be stoked, and never too early or too late, or to put on another log. And he definitely was a fan of having a fire going all the time. I remember very specifically how this fireplace was used, not just the fireplace to build a fire, but also the area in front of it, where my grandfather or many other family members would stretch out with a pillow and read a book or sit and have a conversation. I remember my grandfather would sit and have a conversation, sort of stare up at the ceiling, and he would also fall asleep like that, as I would sometimes, or my uncles.
The fireplace was very difficult because, particularly in the summertime, when it was filled with water and fish, it was just too tempting for a little one. And they would scoot as quickly as they could over there. And of course, they were always in the water. Or somebody was always chasing to get them out. And of course, with the open fireplace in the winter, we had to be very careful. They soon learned, but when they were tiny, we had to watch them all the time. Well, the kitchen is a typical Wright kitchen, the galley kitchen in the Usonian house. But it's not always as convenient as, I don't know how much cooking Mr. Wright did. Eric never found it a problem. And he and I used to cook in there a lot, or the kids or whatever, but he loved, he cooked up the big turkeys and, made the gravy and the potatoes and so on and so forth. But it was never, for example, if the dishwasher were open, you couldn't walk past it. And you couldn't open the refrigerator door if the dishwasher were open. So it was, and I always wondered whether Mr. Wright ever thought about that. Like somebody might open the refrigerator when someone else was loading the dishwasher, but that, I don't think that was important to him as far as the design, the ultimate design, and I can understand that. But if you're using a kitchen every day, the convenience, some of the conveniences weren't there.
Right from the day one, we were told, I was told, anybody who would listen was told that certain things were going to be the way they are because that's the way Mr. Wright wanted it. And do I remember that? Absolutely, I remember it. The kitchen, it's small because that's the way Mr. Wright wanted it. The bathrooms, if you've taken a look, are very small because Mr. Wright didn't think bathrooms were important. And why waste space with bathrooms? So they're very small.
Mr. Wright, no one ever called him anything but Mr. Wright. He was so dignified. But he came here and stayed with us a couple of times, and then we went to visit him a few times. It was delightful. He loved music, and he was Welsh, as I am, so we had several things in common.
He was always gracious and witty. He had a marvelous sense of humor. He was always very pleasant, regardless of the circumstances, whether I was with him, whether we were talking to him about our house, or whether we were talking on the phone.
During the construction, when we were in our other house, Mr. Wright came to visit. And although I don't remember a lot about that visit, I do specifically remember him coming into the house, into the living room, and I am not certain how old he was, but he was certainly an elderly gentleman at that time. And people were concerned that he get an adequate night's sleep, a complete night's sleep, so that what I specifically remember is going around and putting pillows over the telephone, just in case we got a telephone call, and so the ring wouldn't wake him up.
He always wore his pork pie hat. Couldn't imagine why anyone would wear anything else.
The house really never changed from the time I first saw it until now. And I always kind of wondered, although I had been in other Frank Lloyd Wright houses, some of which did not have Wright furniture, some had a mixture of Wright furniture and other furniture, but they really felt that whatever Mr. Wright had said and had originally suggested, that is the way that it would always be. And I think that's the way they wanted it to be. I probably would have made it a little more my own, and I probably would have introduced some other things and to make it more my own. But I think that was never something they wanted to do. So it was a perfect house for them. And of course, when I look at a lot of the other homes, they've had additions added on that were not Mr. Wright's. They've had major changes made so that the house has not remained intact. So this is a wonderful house because it is, as far as a tribute to Mr. Wright, it is the original Usonian house as it was, and the brown house as it always was. So they were, I think, probably maybe some of his favorite clients, because I'm sure there are people who disagreed with him or who had specific things they wanted in a house, and no, we will do this, and so they were perfect people to work with him, and it worked out great for them.
I think one of the nice things about the architecture here and what Frank Lloyd Wright, I think, was trying to do, maybe, at least what I've noticed, is the space in this room that I've noticed how it affects what other people, maybe not only just how you come into this room and you feel relaxed. Sometimes you feel more connected to nature outside. Sometimes you just feel sort of removed from our busy daily schedule, able to have a discussion, talk about things. I think maybe even just open the mind to hearing other people's opinions and discuss other philosophies or whatnot. I know that was an important thing for my grandparents, and it was a nice add to this beautiful place and to growing up here. Music in this house was a very important piece of not only the house and the energy here, but also the living room.
Mr. Wright intended it that we have 2 grand pianos in the living room, sort of cradled into each other, and we had those for years. Because I taught piano lessons, and it was nice if a child played a concerto, I could accompany him.
The house was designed with space for 2 pianos, which was very important to us both. My dad was a piano teacher, and when I was 3 years old, he bought a Mason and Hamlin grand piano, which we had and brought here. And then we also needed a second piano, and so at the Wings Stadium, they had a piano, a Steinway, that was a very good piano that became available when they no longer had the kind of programs that initially they started with. So we bought that. Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley had both performed over that piano. And so we had those 2 pianos. And that was important because Ann did a lot of piano teaching. And she played 2 pianos a lot with people like Mary Jane Sullivan. And that through the years has been extremely important to us.
Eric played the violin, so we had a lot of fun playing together. And I had my 2 music clubs here often, so music was very important. And Mr. Wright made the acoustics absolutely perfect in that living room.
I used to come over to my grandparents' house often in the afternoon and do some painting with my grandmother. That was something she loved to do, and we would sometimes even paint the flowers outside if it was warm enough, or we would paint from what they referred to as the playroom, and the windows in there were beautiful and big, and you could even paint the flowers from inside. And it was fun as a child to be able to paint with my grandmother. I was never as good of a painter, but just sort of the feeling here was very artistic, and it was easy to be able to just kind of let yourself go and try whatever you could with painting.
Well, this house always was used by many, many people. Eric and Ann entertained a lot in a lot of different groups. They loved it. And this room lent itself to that, of course.
We've had some receptions after some of the Kalamazoo Symphony Orchestra concerts. Andre Watts came once and played, and I think Van Cliburn came once, and they sat down and played, as have a lot of other interesting people.
One night after the symphony, when we had maybe 200 guests here, the 2 back bathrooms backed up, so the toilets backed up into the shower. This was a disaster.
I think I first really appreciated the fact that what my grandfather had accomplished was very unique was when I had a chance to visit Taliesin West, and that was back in about 1997, and had a chance to take the tour there. And the tour director told me that very few Frank Lloyd Wright homes were actually built with Frank Lloyd Wright personally visiting the home and working with the family to construct it. And she said, of course, many folks that built those homes have now sold them or turned them into museums, But when she learned that my grandfather had done this and was still living in the home, it was most unusual. And she told me that it would be incredible to get his perspective on what he learned and how he partnered with Frank Lloyd Wright and get that on tape, because they're really trying to capture all these memories and all the learning for the younger architects that are being mentored out there by apprentices that actually train directly underneath Frank Lloyd Wright.
I've always felt that that whatever makes you comfortable is right. And so, although many people wouldn't be comfortable in this home, Ann and Eric wouldn't be comfortable in another kind of home either. I just think that for each person, it's different. And some people focus more on the building, the bricks and mortar and the structure. Some people focus more on the people, inside the house. Or some people focus on, if they're sentimental, they may like grandma's desk or, their grandfather's antique, whatever. And to them, it's comfortable. So I think it has to be comfortable to really be a home. And I think that they would not have been comfortable and as they lived here more and more years, they became, this to them was what a home should be. And sometimes almost to the extent that it should be for everyone. But I've always felt that everybody, for whatever reason, has their own special kind of thing that appeals to them and that they're comfortable with, and that's right.
I've been asked from time to time, what difference did it make in your life growing up in a Frank Lloyd Wright house? And I know my father has thought that there's some spirituality in the house. Maybe even it has some kind of a soul, which probably I don't believe. But for me, the difference is that I think his genius, Frank Lloyd Wright's genius, is he knew how to put something together in a way that made sense and feels right when I look at it. When I look out at the roof line, when I look at this ceiling, it seems to be in balance and make sense. And when you live in a house like that and spend some time, then that becomes part of you, so that when you go to another house or another building that doesn't look quite in balance, it makes you much more conscious of that. So as I've thought about it, that difference is, I think I have an appreciation for a design that fits and works and is in balance, and I'm much more conscious of that than I probably otherwise would be.